Alright, Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you. Bible. Smack. Today I am kind of going over a conversation between Ray Comfort and Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is representing atheism, and Ray Comfort is the Christian. Now, one thing to kind of understand when I'm watching this, and this applies to that verse, is that I really kind of felt like Ray screwed a lot more things up than Matt. And that's not good, because Matt's an atheist. But essentially the deal is that Ray Comfort is an evangelist. And he's great at evangelism. But an evangelist is not an apologist. Now, I'm going to talk about Ray's skills. And so when I talk about his skills, I'm going to liken them to something secular. It's not to say that he's not doing them with earnest piety and all that kind of stuff. But I want you to kind of understand what's really kind of going on here. You see, as an evangelist, Ray's skills are like marketing and sales. And basically, Ray knows how to give a message that's market-based and give a message for sales. He can interact with someone one-on-one or give a presentation. He is extremely gifted and talented at that skill. The problem is that he's in a 2-hour quasi-debate. And Matt Dillahunty is basically, I'd consider him an amateur philosopher. As far as I know, I've heard that he doesn't have more than a high school diploma. But he's in his 50s, he's extremely skilled, has worked his arguments out for years, and is recognized as an expert. So when he gives his defense of his views, he's doing so from a philosophical standpoint. And Ray's methods are not built for that. Ray is either he's arrogant, thinking that his abilities and talents are an end-all be-all, or B, he knows his talents are not that excellent in this format, but he knows that he has a big audience, and he could potentially get a bigger audience. Therefore, the more fanfare, the more notoriety, perhaps the more income. I don't know, depending on how his YouTube works. But while it might be good in that way, it's really not constructive. And Matt Dillahunty is a fellow who, confesses to have been not only once a Christian, but a Southern Baptist deacon. He's expressed his knowledge of what the gospel is. And being that the case, and there are things that I think that I'd still disagree with him in his interpretation. The simple fact of the matter is, though, is that he has heard the gospel. He claimed to at one time believed the gospel. And this is not really being fully understood. Because this is where that passage about don't cast your pearls before swine. Evangelism is about introducing somebody to faith. Apologetics is defending the faith. The evangelist looks like a marketer, looks like a salesman. Okay? He's selling a product. The apologist is the defender, lawyer in a court case. Okay? He is setting forth his case, defending his faith. And perhaps doing it in real courts at times. But basically, this is really instructive in many ways because Matt is able to really deal out a lot of theological problems with Ray's system and some of the theology that Ray employs. Ray, from what I know, used to be an independent Baptist, and a lot of the people in his ministry now kind of lean more towards Reformed theology and Calvinism. Ray himself has said that he's neither a Calvinist nor an Arminian. That is his claim. And basically, a good way of understanding this, you might kind of look at a YouTube guy, Kevin Thompson. Because Kevin Thompson talks about how many Baptist churches have worship and other things designed from a Reformed tradition. And even though they're not Reformed right now, they have these little mimetic devices and ideas implanted into their thinking, which can then sucker them back into Reformed theology. And so, like with Ray, I think that a lot of these Calvinistic presuppositions kind of leak their way through. So, here's some issues that Ray has, and also we'll deal with some of the questions dealt with. Lordship Salvation versus faith. Now, Ray, I think when I first read him, I think he was doing okay. I like the way he presented it, and using the law as a way of saying, the law convicts the sinner, and now he needs grace. But nowadays, it's now he needs repentance. And so this idea of you got to do this, you got to do this. You're not saved enough. If you lost your faith, well, obviously you didn't do it good enough. So you got to do more, you got to do more, you got to do more. And if you ever come to a point where you reject the gospel, well, you just didn't do enough. So this is where Matt makes a great point. He basically says, look, if we ascend to this, if we follow your system and it fails, well, then it just, now we're to blame for that. It's our fault. You can never be falsified. You can never be wrong. And so that is I think now, a couple years ago, I did a radio debate with Paleocrat, Jeremiah Bannister, and he at the time was apostate. Now, nowadays he's a Catholic, which is kind of weird. It's a step up, but it's still not the right religion, but at least there's a Jesus and there's a God and everything like that. And I think he's very devout and hopeful that either, he's gotten born again or maybe he'll, get the religion right so that he will if he's not yet. But nevertheless, we dealt this one out, dealing with the apostasy issue. And so basically, Jeremiah made a very strong point, and I think Matt does too. It's not that he wasn't emotional about faith. And so, he had desires to be part of the group, to please people, to please God, to do, he was a religious person. And so, I think Matt and I think Jeremiah both expressed a lot of great angst and turmoil at these charges. And these charges do come at a very legalistic and arrogant position. You're this, and you're that, and you're that. You're not agreeing with me? Boom! Look at you. Look at you. And a lot of times Christians don't realize they're doing that. I think this is where Ray did come off a little disingenuous. Here's a guy who's rejected the gospel, and he's like, oh no, I'll bring him to faith. It'll be great. You're not really guaranteed to bring him to faith because you're talking about the same gospel he rejected. The point of apologetic is just to say, all right, look, if you're going to attack the faith now, we're going to defend the faith. Evangelism is not in the cards anymore. Now, conversion is, but you're not going to have it happen in that sitting. I mean, this guy is, probably getting paid. If he is getting paid, he's getting paid good money. But he's definitely getting a lot of reward out of being the representative of the atheist position. He's not coming there to listen. He's coming there to win. So then that is something that becomes so obvious that it's understood. So by, saying, oh, well, I'll turn him and all this kind of stuff, really doesn't help anybody. And in fact, after a while, even some of his, well, I love you, it becomes so repetitive that it starts to become offensive. Because you're just giving him the same old answers. He's not really caring. You're just reading from a script. And so I think that's something that Matt was picking up there. I kind of felt it too. And, this is why you don't use evangelism as your apologetic. The free will issue. Ray is hanging out with all these Calvinists, and he's not really knowing how to argue for free will because he doesn't want to sound bad in front of his Calvinist friends. And so he's just like, oh, this is really ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And, Matt is an expert on dealing with these issues, and so he fires right back. He's like, you don't prove anything just by saying it's ridiculous. You got to demonstrate it. As far as free will, the Calvinists demonize free will. And as a result, you almost feel ashamed to have that position that you believe in free will. But free will is not a merit in evangelical theology, even among the Arminians, and I would say also the Provisionists. So basically what you have is you have the issue of responsibility. And we're responsible for evil. Matt Dillahunty wants to say, well, why did God make me an atheist? And he's like, well, I wasn't convinced. Convince me. Well, the sales pitch is not going to convince him because he accepted the sales pitch, then he rejected it. But he did accept the sales pitch. So you could say that you can believe because you did believe. But where does that leave things? And this is where you get the Arminian Calvinism debate. Well, they're stuck in this paradigm of Lordship Salvation. And Lordship Salvation does not understand the Scriptures properly. Because if you understand the Scriptures properly, then you'll understand the transition from Judaism and the apostleship to the Jews, the apostleship and the gospel, the good news, to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are not under the law. Repentance of sin is turning from the denying the law of God to accepting the law of God. And the Christian is not saved upon the law system. They are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ for what he did on the cross. Now, when we look at this issue of free will, what happens is that, you have the issue of inherited guilt and original sin. And basically, it is true that all mankind is sinful. And it is connected to the work of Adam. But if God is all-powerful and he intends to make people with free will, And he did because he gave Adam dominion over the earth. Therefore, Adam has to accomplish what God wanted him to accomplish. And that was accomplish free will and independent thought. And when Adam did this, then that's what he did to the human race and not what God did to the human race. So God is not tempting people to sin. Adam is tempting people to sin. And he did it freely by destroying his own spiritual innocence and then falling into sin. Now, it is not true from the Bible. You see this especially in Ezekiel 18. You also see it in the fact that it says God never tempts anyone to sin, which is roughly James 1:13. Maybe do 14 or read the whole chapter, but I believe it's 1:13. Basically, God does not force people to sin. They choose to sin. When he has these worldviews, if he could choose to believe, and apparently that's what he's claiming, he chose to believe, then he could choose not to believe. But the issue of faith that I posed in my debate with Jeremiah was that I questioned him. I said, do you know that you are saved? And at this point, Jeremiah is a professing atheist. He's like, I don't know, because I'm obviously not saved, because I'm obviously going to hell. I don't believe in God. And so he did not know. And the salvation faith is a faith that is knowledge. It is not simply a group of works, and then hopefully you do enough works to prove yourself faithful. But instead, Jesus proves himself faithful to save you with his works. Now this is where there's a contention from Dillahunty about blood atonement. The real problem with all this is that atheism denies the authority of history. If we look back into history, what are we seeing? We're seeing people in the past giving observations for us. And we can argue with reason on whether those observations are accurate, but we cannot argue that those observations are not happening. So once you kind of get to that point, you have to take history as where the origin comes from. Matt Dillahunty denies all origin theory. He is agnostic on the issue of how we got here, which really puts in question, how do we know that any of this stuff is going? We can't really know the present if we don't know the past. So the worldview foundation is therefore correct. And when we look at God and the way this world is, you have to go through history. If you want to judge God on how he created things, then you got to go back to creation. How dare God create a world without sin or death? No. God has created a good world, but that good world was free, and because it was free, then we have death and suffering. Now, also, by the fact that God's all-powerful and all-knowing, doesn't that mean that he's determined everything? But actually, no, he's determined something of everything. He's determined a choice of everything. Because if God has chosen to make a guy like Matt Dillahunty, he's also chosen to make people who witness to Matt. And people who've witnessed Matt accepting Christ. So it's not true that his will is not free, and you can't blame God for the works of the devil. This is kind of where the kicker is. Man does things, the devil does some things. Well, they do them. That's why they're judged. God has final authority, and he can judge them, and he can judge us. But he is sustaining our abilities, sustaining our will to do whatever it is that we need to do. The caveat, however, is that God does not take away his sovereignty from controlling destiny. So we can think and attempt what we want, but yet God makes his plan effective, even if the plans of man are against that. Now, there was a question about, and also then there's the blood atonement. So the blood atonement is this idea that goes all the way back to the times of Noah, where you would kill, and when you killed things, there was blood sacrifice. And Noah was commanded not to eat blood because life is in the blood. Now, Ray offered up a bad theology, which is popular, and it is a dichotomy where the soul is the spirit. But the soul is the mind, will, and emotions, while the spirit is the life force. So there is a distinction. And it's a needed one. But basically, the life is in the blood. The spirit is in the blood. So the spirit has to leave the body. The penalty of sin is death. And so with a blood sacrifice, you have a death. And you have a debt that is potentially paid. So that's the whole point there. Alright, getting a little bit on the drowsiness. But, Matt throws out some things. So basically, if Matt was a believer, then he was convinced that it is a free offer. And so he's responsible if he does not believe in God. Wrestling about the atheist definition. Wah, wah, wah. Atheism is not claiming anything. You have the burden of proof. Boo-hoo. It is commonly understood that many who are secular humanists will simply call themselves atheists. When Matt Dillahunty gets up in front of hundreds and thousands of people, in the past he's gotten up in front of over 1 million people, and he proposes and defends the ideas of atheism, well, then he is pushing a noun. Okay, there is a thing. If there's a thing, this negation of God means something. So that's kind of where they play the name game there. Falsifiable. Your worldview axioms are unfalsifiable because you don't know the whole world. So you gather the whole world of your information into a rubric. And from that rubric, then you are able to argue from a frame of reference. Everybody does it. Okay? Some do it worse than others. You should have something where you're able to change your mind. But if you make a belief become an axiom, then you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Okay? Once the idea is an axiom, you're never going to change it. Naturalism is unfalsifiable. Why? Because if they ever run into anything that opposes nature, then they'll simply write a new law of science. So it just keeps on changing. So going back to this, faith is knowledge, and then Ray Comfort would then throw in that idea that understanding that faith is a relationship. And it's a relationship in that sense of the knowledge. Now that he has a working relationship with God, and he has experienced God, he's not going to pretend that he hasn't. But also, that is where the knowledge comes from. The knowledge comes from the relationship. If you start a relationship with God, He will demonstrate himself to you, and yes, he will know you. But yeah, the atheist motif is historical ignorance. The atheist wants to go like John Locke and start off with a blank slate. And this is why we have such deep divisions. Because we can look at historical reality. Alright, and the woman came out of Adam's rib. Well, this explains historically what happened and why it happened. It does not do so scientifically, but it is an observation, just like science. And let's see here. And what was it? We got the existence of the spirit. Matt Dillahunty said that he does not believe in that. And I say it's an ignorant position. Why do I say that's an ignorant position? Well, for the simple fact there is science that backs that up. There is an idea called the binding problem, where your eyes and your optics sense different things, and then they run down these cable cords in your nerve cells. And when it goes back there, all the information is then spun around, and then it comes back into the brain as an idea. But the information actually leaves the brain. Also, there's near-death experiences. And there's a fella, his name was Eben Alexander. I could have that a little bit off, but not too much. Anyhow, he was a neuroscientist who ended up being brain dead in an accident and essentially having near-death experience where the neurosurgeon could not find any stimulating brain activity. Yet, he was not gone yet, and so he stuck around until he got better. But basically, he had huge, massive heavenly visions, and very intricate at that. But how is it that he had these visions when he was brain dead? He had no neurological activity, and yet he had these intimate visions. It's another proof of supernatural. And I always like to argue about Plato and his theory of forms, where you have the thing and then you have the idea of the thing. As this goes out, people are going to be looking at the idea of me and not me. I may leave this room and go other places and do other things, but yet this idea is now going from here to the computer all over the world. And so this idea is a thing in and of itself. And it's not physical. They found worse IDs. Ugh. I don't know if that was right. Obviously, it is starting to get that time. I'm starting to get drowsy. But basically, there's an idea behind the form. And the idea holds up that form's ability to stay as it is. So, nevertheless, that's my thoughts there, and I'll catch you later.